shows just basically the cycles of the sun and how they tie to the astrological symbols and the star signs and so on. It explains what eclipses are about. There were books that explained about mathematics. And once this all started to happen, and more knowledge started to spread, there was a reason for people to get from town A to town B, and the roads started to be built again. And people started to congregate from one city to the next city because libraries started to form. And people were going from library to library. They were learning that they could learn through a book instead of having to go to a master or go to a college to learn things. They could start to read things in books and learn things themselves. And all kinds of things started to come about in books. They started to develop books about weaponry, and they started to develop books about science and anatomy and medicines and herbology, and the sky's the limit. They started to create books about all kinds of materials and all kinds of thinking. Now, there was one group of people that did not like this idea. Anybody think of who that group of people were that did not like this idea of Gutenberg, what he was doing?
Christians.
What is it?
Christians.
The Christian church, yeah. The Christian church. Not happy at all. Not happy at all, because why?
People were learning things and it was smarter.
What else?
They were like losing their influence over people.
Yeah, it was all about influence. What else?
People found out that the Bible didn't say to give the church money, and they figured out the reason why the priests were glowing whenever they read the books. They learned all the tricks that her church was trying to hide.
Yeah. They recognized that there was some charlatanism going on here. That there was some not so above board ideas, and the church was not happy because not only were they losing influence, but they were losing money. Because now people didn't go to the scriptoriums to have any kind of books produced, and they weren't buying books that cost $100,000 anymore. So they had no need to go to the scriptoriums anymore, and the church was losing money off of this. So, you want to hurt somebody hit them in the pocketbook, and that really hit the church in the pocketbook, to the point where they would actually hire henchmen to go in and destroy any printing presses that started to crop up in the towns in which they were living. Which, again, fostered more people that were angry with them, and then we had the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation as a result of this. Martin Luther came along, he wrote his 92 Theses, denouncing what the church was about, and created the first factioning of the church into Protestantism. Protestant meaning protest. So they were protesting the Christian church, and then from there came the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church and then the Lutheran Church and so on. Getting back to Gutenberg, to answer Jessica's question, go ahead.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
During the iconoclasm, was a lot destroyed, like as far as print too?
I'm sorry, during the what?
Iconoclasm? Was like a lot of print destroyed as well, like, as an art?
As a means of holding back information, you betcha. So anytime that people want to hold back information, destroying written information, or calling it evil or the works of evil, is the first way that they do it. So they try to get people to disbelieve in the information that they have, or they destroy books. That's part of the reason why book burnings happened when Hitler came along. Did not like the idea that people were getting ideas from written information, so they burned books. And now you see people saying fake news, not believing the news, and basically doing the same thing, pouring fire on what could be facts, and denouncing it. As far as Gutenberg goes, Gutenberg was a very sad man after his all of his work was stolen from him, but he didn't give up. He still had the recipe. He still knew how to do all of this. All of that work did not go in vain. He had the knowledge now in how to do this, and so he remade the work that he did. He created new punches and new matrices and new slugs, and he created a whole new set of characters. He produced a new printing plant, and he produced another written work. In his case, he created something called the Catholicon, which he knew that, actually, he did do another Bible. Instead of doing a 42-line Bible, which is what the original one was, this one was a 36-line Bible, still a big, massive work, and then he created this thing called Catholicon, which is a cross between an encyclopedia and a dictionary. So it was the two items kind of tied together. So there's another market for him to fit into. His work was not quite as beautiful as the work of Fust and Schoeffer, because they had his original stuff, but he did manage to have some success. We also credit Gutenberg with creating another form of printing. It's still tied to relief printing, but this one is called engraving. And it really ties back to this character, this thing, the matrix that we looked at that was part of his invention. What he realized was that if he had a bunch of these matrices that were put together, that he could use those the same way that he was using them as a template for printing. So he started to play with this idea both in letter form and through printing. In the printing side of it, especially in creating illustrations, he could do some really incredible stuff with it. So let me diagram or show you what engraving looks like, and you can see how this kind of idea fits into it. So engraving is the same principle where you have an image that you want to create. So when we looked at wood block printing, we saw that what was happening was that you were inking the raised surfaces of the printing plate and then rubbing the ink onto a piece of paper from there. Engraving is almost the opposite of that, in that you're carving out grooves, but that's where the ink is set into, and you're pulling the ink out of those grooves. So instead of having the ink on a raised surface, the ink is on a submerged surface. Okay? So what happens is, in this particular case, you can take a wood block, or you can take a linoleum block, or you can take a metal plate, and you carve out of it. You carve lines into it. And because metal is such a hard surface, if you gouge into metal, that's pretty permanent. It doesn't rub off, it doesn't go away, and you can get a lot of ink into those grooved areas. And then from those scratched off areas, those chiseled away areas that are incised into the metal or the wood or the linoleum block, you would rub ink over the entire surface. And then you would rub off the surface ink, the stuff that's sitting on the raised areas, so that if you have very fine lines, the ink is set into those fine lines and it stays there. It's hard to get it out. You have to kind of dig with your fingernail to get them out of those incised areas. But if you're just rubbing it with a rag, the ink stays in those areas. And then if you take a piece of paper, lay it over top of it, and you put a lot of pressure down on that paper, then when you pull the paper off, then the ink pulls out of those grooved areas and you get a print. So with this, you can start to do some really intricate illustrations, really intricate kinds of printing methods. And I'm willing to bet everybody here has an example of engraving with them somewhere on their person. Anybody guess what I'm talking about or thinking about? An example of engraving that you might have with you someplace here in this room.
Shoes or something, I don't know. Like, you got jewelry or anything?
Look at this here and see if it reminds you of anything.
Belt
The
buckle?
manufacturer title on my glasses.
Nope, but that's a good guess. Anybody else? What?
No, fingerprint?
No, but that's a good guess. That's actually an example of relief printing, but anybody else? Anybody got a dollar bill on them?
Nope.
Well, maybe
Or a
some of you don't
plastic.
have it. Maybe some of you don't have it. But
Cards
if you're
only.
carrying around cash, cold hard cash, money, paper money, that's engraved. And so you can see, if you look at your money, you can see how intricate those lines are. If you take a magnifying glass and look at it real close, you can see that it's not laser printed. That's all done through engraving. And so it's a very intricate process, and you can do some really intricate stuff. All right, so
Well, I think aren't they digital now? They they made a new face. Is there some digital augmentation to it now?
there is holographic elements
Yeah, okay,
that
that's
they
what-
placed into the bill. So the money is very, very complex in how it's manufactured, and they have a paper company that they hired. They're the only ones that have the recipe for making paper for the U.S. Mint. Nobody else is. So they have a special paper that is purchased only through this one company, and that company has agreed never to sell it to the public, so nobody can ever have access to the paper that the U.S. government uses for printing money. And they use multiple printing methods now. It used to be just engraving, but now they've mixed it with holographic printing and and other kinds of printing that are added into it. So it's really, really complex, the printing.
Gotcha.
That's what trying to dissuade forgery. It's very hard
Gotcha.
to forge cash money as a result of that. But in any case, that was an invention that we give Gutenberg credit for also coming up with, the idea of engraving. And from there, people started to mix and match the idea of engraving with their letterpress printing, the printing that Gutenberg was using. Here's a quote that I like to pull up that I think is really kind of insightful, because it kind of ties into this whole conversation about what Gutenberg did, and it ties into what's going on today. The quote, "The major advances in civilization are processes which all affect the societies in which they occur," is attributed to a guy named Alfred North Whitehead, who was a mathematician and a philosopher. So what does this mean? I know it's a mouthful. Think about it for a second. The major advances in civilization are processes which all but wreck the societies in which they occur. Let's change out major advances in civilization, and let's say something like the printing press is a process which all but wrecks the society in which it occurred. What does that mean?
All right, in short, it's the best metaphor I could give you is almost like the Buddhist quest for nirvana, like a death and rebirth cycle until you suppose you reach whatever the end of it is.
Okay, what do you think, Jessica?
It's kind of like if you put something in a society that fixes a problem, so that problem no longer is a problem, it changes what the society thinks of said problem.
Good, yeah. So in Gutenberg's time, the printing press changed society. How did it change society?
Cheaper books.
Cheaper books, which created
People were more educated.
more education, right, which created
Literacy.
and more books beyond that. And so how did this wreck society though? Go ahead.
Because people had like different ideas on different things, so they were like, this is how the world is. No, this is how the world is.
Yeah. So that terminology that Whitehead is using here is really kind of putting you into the moment of when society is changing, when that innovation is changing or wrecking society. Because when we look at it from hindsight, if we look now at what Gutenberg did, we would say that's a good thing, right? Yes? I think we can all agree that more literacy, education, and all of that stuff were a good thing. But for the folks that were living in that time, especially if you're the Christian church, not such a good thing. The world is changing. It's becoming very, very scary. It's not the same world that they had monopoly on for years and years and years. How do we relate that to today? What things are wrecking society, changing society, making it not the same as what it is now? Kelly? Phones. How are they changing? How are they wrecking society?
People are so involved in their phones that they don't speak to each other.
Good. What else? What other things are wrecking society?
How much cynicism do you want here?
Go for it. Because here's the counter. We can look at what Gutenberg did and we can now say, with hindsight, that it's a good thing. We probably, 20 years from now, will say phones were a good thing. What do you think?
Just like small businesses that like made up things prior to the phone, like home lines are no longer used, and like stores aren't as used because of online shopping, just like little things like that.
Right. So we're living in this time where great innovation is happening. What else?
We have like so much access to like information. It's kind of making us lazy. We're not using our brains. It's not making us like challenge ourselves. I guess.
Right. It's very easy to just like look up something instead of critically analyzing something or having a conversation about it. What else?
Don't have to use books.
Yeah.
It's all tech now.
Yeah. I mean, do we think that printing is going to stick around?
Well, I studied journalism undergrad, and that was about 15 years ago. And what we were always taught was that it's like, paper may go out of style, but words won't.
Right. So there will be a place for these folks. What else, Jessica?
Isn't like I remember like these quotes from the older generation that said the same thing about books, the written language, and stuff like that. And isn't it more like the when I was your age argument?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
When
exactly
I was
what
your
he's saying.
age,
That's
isn't
what
it?
Whitehead is saying. It was like, when I was your age, we had this, and now we have this, and that's, for the folks that are saying when I was your age, they think that's a bad thing. But for the folks that are living in the time past it, they say, oh, it's a good thing. It's a good thing those things changed. That world changed as a result. So it's a matter of perspective. This quote is really about the perspective in which you're living in. So we can point to this. We can point to innovations and changes, and you can point to anything that has happened. If I ask this question 10 years ago, people would have a different answer then, and now we can look at their answers and say, okay, well, maybe that wasn't such a scary thing after all. Maybe the world isn't so dramatically different. For the folks in Gutenberg's time, the church itself was very, very fearful of what was happening because they had all of these monks that were employed in scriptoriums. But those folks that worked in the scriptoriums actually became part of the printing trade. They became part of the world of creating more books. A lot of them were skilled as artists, so they could do those embellishments on books, and so for a long number of years that was, they kept with that. They used those embellishments inside the books that they would hand illuminate, hand draw, because that was the tradition. They weren't quite ready to walk away from that. As time went on, got rid of that, but it took many, many years for that to fade away. It was part of tradition. A lot of them, because they were gifted in or skilled in literacy, they used their skills to teach other people how to read and write. So they were hired as teachers, and so they moved into other realms. So there was a place for those folks, and it's the same thing that's happening now. It's like, okay, so some folks, obviously they don't keep up with what's happening. Those folks that expect that their jobs are going to come back to the coal mines, that's not going to happen. But we can accept that, maybe there's a place that those folks can fit into society if they're willing to re-educate themselves, if they're willing to integrate into society today. So it cycles around, and if we give it a long view, we start to see that these changes are for the better, that progress always happens. As far as the difference between letterpress and engraving, I just have some examples that I want to show you. I want to point out to you that when we do letterpress printing, which is with these raised characters, the slugs that I was showing you, you see that the paper has an indent into it. And so this is one of the telltale traits that we can tell between printing with letterpress and when we print with, when we do engraving, because letterpress has those letters punching into the paper, and so it creates that recess. Whereas with engraving, it actually pulls the paper away from itself, and so it has a raised surface to it. I have some examples here that I'm going to pass around. You guys can all look at them. The white card that has some kind of a Christmas message on it, those ones are examples of letterpress. And the ones that are on the colored pieces of paper, those ones are the engraving. I want you just to touch them, to feel them, to pass them around so that you can get to know what the difference is between engraving and letterpress. Again, the letterpress ones are the ones that are on the white paper, so that's a relief printing method, whereas the ones that are on the colored piece of paper, those are engraving, and it's a different printing method. So that printing method, again, looks like, this, that, where they're incising into the paper. I ask this because it's part of the test. So I want you guys to get to know the different kinds of printing methods that we're talking about here. All right. The next great innovation that came along was the steam engine. And that took several hundred years before it came along. But it probably was the next great thing that happened. We went through a period that we call the Renaissance, where there was a rebirth of knowledge, or knowledge that had been passed on from prior generation, from thousands of years back, that was reintroduced into the general public. They started to learn about the things that the Romans had known about, that the Greeks had known about. And so that knowledge started to create new ideas for people. And once they had those new ideas, new inventions started to be developed. And this was one of those inventions that came along as a result of it. So indirectly, we can give Gutenberg credit for creating the steam engine. Not that he actually created the steam engine, but he created the momentum, the movement of knowledge and ideas that eventually led to the steam engine. We actually don't know who the person was that created the steam engine. engine. It was something that happens, evolved over the course of time. The first story of the steam engine that we know of that was used used as a pump to pump water out of a mine that had been flooded. And so they hooked up a pump, which was already a simple conveyance, something that had been used for a very long time. But they hooked it up with water, with a heating tank, and they enclosed this tank, and they had a piston that was doing the levering instead, the basis for what steam engines are. So every time that the steam would start to rise, it would push on the piston, and once it rose to the top, then the air would be released, all that steam would be released, and then that piston would drop down again. So it's that motion, that lever motion, that started to happen as a result of adding steam power fire underneath a kettle of water and hooking it up to all of this. And that created a great machine that started to be used in all kinds of things. Can anybody think of things that would have been used for steam power once this idea of steam engines came along?
I mean, where do you start? I mean, I don't know. They got the railroads. Yeah, I'm kind of not sure what time frame you're at.
Railroads came along.
And you see
Railroads
steamships
came
and
along.
all that.
Steamships, what else?
Actually,
Anybody
cars
think
at
of-
one point.
What do you think?
Factories?
Yeah, factories started to hook up all kinds of equipment to steam power. And yeah, cars, there was a time when somebody came up with the idea of steam powering a car. It wasn't very successful. They kept on having it blow up on them. But yeah, one of the first cars that was created was a steam powered car. What else?
Boats?
Boats, yeah, absolutely. You see those paddle wheel boats? That's steam power. Anybody else? Lots. Okay, we're going to talk about some of the other developments that came along. One of them was steam powered on a printing press. And so once we get into that, then we can start to see how things are going to start to speed up for printing. So I'm going to leave it there for today. Any questions?
So we got a test in 2 weeks, I guess, if I read it right.
Yeah, and on Monday I'll hand out a study guide for you. You can
Okay.
get it already. It's online, so if you go to the Blackwood site, you can see the study list.
Okay.
But I'll hand those out to you guys
Just
on Monday.
just definitions of those people, pretty much.
Yeah, so
Okay.
get to know who those people are, what they're, there will be no identification on the next test, so
Okay.
image identification, so you don't have to memorize any pictures.
Okay.
But you should know what those folks are known for.